Good morning, everyone. Your Excellency Iván Duque Márquez, President of Colombia, Excellency Raquel Peña, Vice President of the Dominican Republic, Secretary General of the OECD, Ángel Gurría, and of course, Mauricio Claver-Carone, my friend, President of the IDB, and Bertrand Walckenaer, Associate Chief Executive Officer of Agence Française de Développement. And of course, Mr. Borrell, it is good to see you, the High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. I had a speech prepared this morning, but I don't want the speech, and I'd like to see your faces. Because the last time the world faced a major crisis was with the World War II. And we decided, as a global community, those of us who had the agency of voice, not those who were not yet independent, that they would form a global community rested upon the United Nations Declaration as well as the Bretton Woods institutions. Out of that also came the World Health Organization. Crises are tragic, but they're only tragic if we do nothing about it. We have faced in the last 18 months, 16 months, 18 months, depending on when you take your marker, a crisis of global proportion. No one ever anticipated that the world would stop in 2020. 2020 was the year to perfect a finer vision for our global humanity. But what that vision revealed in 2020 is the absolute need for urgent reform of our international institutions. It also revealed that there is an absence of global moral strategic leadership. For if that leadership existed, we would not, in my view, still be fighting in the way in which we are fighting from so many levels, with the containment of this virus, with the absence of vaccine equity, and with the terrible debt crisis and financial crisis that potentially could be spawned from this health pandemic. I, therefore, ask us as we reflect today whether we should not be involved in serious reform of the international architecture. It's not nice to have, but it is now necessary and vital. We need to supplement eligibility criteria for concessionary finance that is more sensitive to current and future vulnerabilities than that which is now captured in past measures of GDP, which quite frankly is completely irrelevant when you consider the circumstances of our countries. Similarly, while we look at GDP, we know it is not the only measure. And our vulnerability, particularly those of small island developing states, has been captured by our performance last year. All of the tourism and travel dependent countries of the world, all had double-digit declines, and the only countries that were as bad and possibly one worse were those that were war-torn. That is not what the global community set out to achieve when we established the Bretton Woods institutions or when we established the WHO in 1948 that was supposed to be able to help us contain events like this. Similarly, we know that this is not likely to be the last. I co-chair the One Health Global Initiative with the Prime Minister of Bangladesh that is confronted with the specter of this slow motion pandemic, that of antimicrobial resistance, that is expected to kill more people by 2050 than any other cause of death. And the reality is that that slow motion pandemic threatens to reverse a century of medical progress because of our overabuse of antibiotics, our overabuse of chemicals and other antibiotics on livestock, humans, but also on our plants. Similarly, we need a more universal automatic debt standstill arrangement that captures both the public and private sector debt. The debt service suspension initiative was timely when it was announced last year, and it was a welcome measure. But alas, it was way too limited. Developing countries have approximately 1 trillion of debt service between 2020 and 2022, with the larger proportion being to the private sector. The debt service suspension initiative covered a mere $11 billion of public sector debt. And may I say, the majority of that has not even been eaten up, even as we speak, by the countries that are eligible to use it. In between, the poor countries and indeed the rich countries that could benefit from quantitative easing in excess of $10 trillion, we have the middle-income countries who cannot easily access capital markets, and we have small island developing states who are considered middle income or high income who have been stuck in the middle. We believe that there needs to be certainty with respect to the debt issues of these countries. We recommend the universal adoption by borrowers and lenders, including the international financial institutions, of natural disaster and pandemic clauses in lending arrangements. Barbados, my country, became the world's largest issuer of sovereign bonds with natural disaster clauses. Regrettably, we didn't include a pandemic because we weren't thinking of it. And we recognize, however, that the certainty that is provided by our natural disaster clauses is what is needed now for those countries who are having difficulty in meeting their debt payments with respect, or who have limited fiscal space with respect to the pandemic. Our debt clauses, our natural disaster debt clauses, trigger an automatic 2-year suspension of interest and principal payments, with these payments to be added back to the end of the loan in a net present value neutral way when objective measures of a natural disaster outside of the ability of individual countries to control happens. If we can do this for natural disaster clauses and for pandemics, we provide certainty to both the lender and the borrower in a way that is not there today, and in a way that, regrettably, we have the risk priced in at a greater level of costs to countries that are borrowing simply because of the uncertainty that will happen in a natural disaster or a pandemic based on the vulnerability of that particular nation. My friend, these are some of the ideas that we have literally been trying to discuss at the Development Committee. Why? Because if we accept that disaster clause or the pandemic clause, it will provide 100 times the liquidity of the DSSI and quicker. And I ask us to seriously consider these issues as we work to reform the international financial architecture in circumstances where it has not been the subject of serious reform. We expect that with increased activity in the United States of America and with potentially an increase in short-term interest rates, that the cost of debt will also become prohibitive, making fiscal space unavailable to countries to resume the development trajectory. In Europe, after the world wars, Britain was able to engage in a deferral of its wartime debt such as to allow it to pursue further borrowing for the building out of Britain after the war. We recognize that our own countries literally face similar issues. And finally, before I finish, we need an international clearinghouse for the purchase and sale of vaccines. It cannot be that countries that are here have to be the victim of middlemen in circumstances where global pharmaceutical companies are saying they only deal with countries, but in reality they have dealt with none of the small countries or very few of the small countries, but have had small countries have to deal with middlemen who are selling the vaccines at a premium to small countries. The bottom line is the presence of that international vaccine clearinghouse, the presence of a global summit on COVID will allow us to coordinate our actions both in terms of restrictions, even 16 months later, and it will allow us to be able to fight the race against variants. Can we imagine if none of the 10 vaccines that are currently working now can fight variants? What then will we say, and what then will we do? If the world came together in 1945 to be able to solve the world's problems in 1945, why can't the world in 2021 provide the global leadership that we need to come together? And why? Over 500,000 people in Latin America and the Caribbean have died from COVID in the last 16 months. Over hundreds of millions of people have been affected. Indeed, I suspect the number may be 1.6 billion actually have had COVID, and COVID affect and impact on them in their ordinary lives. I ask us today, truly, and I ask those of our friends in Europe, Mr. Borrell, if we can work together, can we not seek to put a pause and to bring global leadership and coordination both to the issue of how we contain COVID within our borders, how we allow movement, how we deal with the issue of vaccine equity, and most of all, as we discussed in the spring meetings, in doing all of that, how we can bring the world back to a point where we can resume growth, but growth that is green, that is resilient, and that is inclusive. And why do I say so? Today is the 27th of May. In 4 short days, the hurricane season will be upon us. It comes after ashfall from the volcano in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 100 miles away, clouded our nation 6 weeks ago. I had no aid, no support, and no ability to draw on that, but we had to carry the cost of that natural disaster that is not normally contained in our discussion of the climate crisis. Similarly, we've been fighting droughts year after year after year. I asked the global community, what will we do to see those who are on the front line of the disaster, whether it is the pandemic as tourism and travel dependent economies, or whether it is the climate crisis? We will reap what we sow, and I trust it will be with the confidence of the generation of 1945 to do that in a way that brings growth, equity, and fairness to the world, rather than an approach of 2020 that has brought divisiveness, inequity, and indeed unfortunate episodes to countries and much loss of death. Thank you.